My name is Xuqing Xiong. I'm a senior sustainability engineer. I will be talking about the greenhouse gas verification and third-party assurance. So before we get started, I wanted to clarify that we put the greenhouse gas in the title because the greenhouse gas is such a prevailing area nowadays. But really what we will be talking regarding verification and third-party assurance is applicable to all ESG data. So let's get started with the concept. What is greenhouse gas verification? The greenhouse gas verification is essentially the process of having third-party auditing of a company's greenhouse gas disclosure using standards such as ISO 14064-3. So when discussing verification and auditing, this might bring to mind for those in the environmental field of compliance auditing, when the business owners always feel that auditors or the verifiers come in and try to prove that they have done something wrong. But the ESG data verification is really different. It is a much more friendly way, and the verifier and auditors will share best practices on greenhouse gas accounting, reporting, and verification. So the greenhouse gas verification is really a process that can be part of your continuous improvement process. So during the process of greenhouse gas verification, we will really make sure that the data collection procedures and the way you aggregated your data is correct, and we will conduct data analytics to identify any potential data issues, to identify any risks and opportunities. So it really benefits you when you get your data verified. It will make your data more desirable for disclosure. So we also check the calculations, to check the calculation methodology, to check the calculation process, and to check the emission factors. Really, what we are doing is to make sure that your disclosure is in conformance with the relevant standards. Why is greenhouse gas verification important? The first and the most important reason is that it may become a requirement in the near future due to the proposed SEC rules. So once the proposed SEC rule is adopted, there will be a phase-in period with no requirement on the assurance in the first year, but the limited and the reasonable assurance phased in subsequently. So we will be talking about the distinctions between limited and the reasonable assurance shortly. So secondly, it is really a best practice to get all your data verified before disclosure. It's either financial data or health data, safety data, environmental data, and including greenhouse gas data. Certainly, there are other requirements and programs that may require verification. For instance, CDP, carbon neutral, GRESB, sustainability-linked bonds and loans, and it simply can be some requirement from your customers. For instance, Microsoft requires its suppliers to disclose to CDP of their verified greenhouse gas data, and Tesla requires its suppliers to disclose publicly of their verified ESG data. And also, your company has stakeholders, you have organizations from CEO, from employee, you have customers. There must be someone who's interested in your ESG data. So it really be beneficial to provide assurance of the public ESG data to the people who are interested in your operations. And also, I wanted to emphasize it is really an opportunity to identify the risks and opportunities during the process of verification. And also, we talked about greenhouse gas accounting as the first step, and getting your data verified as the next step. But what is the next step? We really wanted to keep the ultimate goal in mind. We wanted to decarbonize. We wanted to be in line with the Paris Agreement. And so we will be making decisions based on the data. It's either implementing the big carbon capture at your facility, or you are switching from carbon-intensive fossil fuel to carbon-free hydrogen, or simply from purchasing power purchase agreement or REC, you will be making decisions based on the data. So you want to be smart and gain more confidence on your data. And here, I included some stats from CDP. It really shows that companies are recognizing the importance of greenhouse gas verification and disclosure. And they are taking actions right now. There were 18,700 companies in 2022 disclosed their data through CDP. And it represents a 38% of increase from 2021. And out of these companies, there were 8,372 disclosed through CDP publicly. And so usually, CDP participant will starting with entering into the program first. They start with disclosing to CDP, and then after several years within the program, they gained confidence in the information and data they gathered. They will start to disclose publicly. So really, the big increase, it will eventually show up in the verification number and the public disclosure number. Who does greenhouse gas verification? It must be a third party and an independent party. It often be accredited. The accreditation is not a requirement, but definitely it's a way to evaluate the competency of your verifier. It can be accounting firms, it can be engineering firms such as us, KERAMIDA, and I'm also proud to say that KERAMIDA is a CDP accredited gold greenhouse verification provider, and all KERAMIDA greenhouse gas verification projects are led by an accredited California and Oregon-led greenhouse gas verifier. Who else can do greenhouse gas verification? It can be other experts who has the expertise to conduct work like this. And I also wanted to note that when you're choosing a verifier, it's not only about who can do it, it's also about you're choosing a good fit for your company. Does the verifier's company has other resources to answer questions about like reporting or any other subject? Or does the verifier's company has enough experience to answer questions comparing the requirements between different platforms? Because your data will be reporting potentially to multiple platforms. Next, talk about the verification process. Typically, there are 5 steps in the verification. And the first step is pre-engagement activities. This is a step when we will talk with the clients about some basic information about the client and about the project in preparation for our step 2, I'm sorry. So we will discuss the operations. What do they do? Are they a manufacturer, or are they a consulting firm with just some leasing offices, or are they a utility provider? And how many locations do they have? Where do they operate? And after these discussions, we will gain knowledge on their emission sources and where they are emitting their greenhouse gas. We will discuss the scope. Are you looking at scope 1 only, or are you looking at scope 1 and scope 2? Do we also need to look at the scope 3, and do we need to include energy data or water data or any other ESG data? And we will also discuss the purpose of the verification. Is it driven by a disclosure? What's the disclosure requirement, and what are the quantification methodology or standards you are using? And then we will talk about the level of assurance with the client. So in the greenhouse gas verification world, there are 2 levels of assurance, limited and reasonable. For a limited level of assurance, the verifier is required to gather sufficient data to determine if a disclosure is reasonable, while a reasonable level of assurance, the verifier is required to gather sufficiently appropriate data to determine if a disclosure is correct. So a limited level of assurance allows negative form of opinion, while a reasonable level of assurance, it requires a positive form of opinion. And the example of a negative form of opinion is based on the process and the procedures conducted. There is no evidence that a disclosure is materially incorrect. While contract to a reasonable level of assurance, the positive form, an example of that is based on the evidence provided, it is our opinion that the greenhouse disclosure is materially correct. So the level of auditing is much higher for a reasonable level of assurance. So what does it mean if you're switching from a limited to a reasonable level of assurance? It means that more interviews will be conducted and more data is subject to review. And currently for a limited level assurance, site visits are not required. But if you are conducting a reasonable level assurance, there are a higher chance that a site visit is required. And the efforts for a reasonable level of assurance is more, and it needs to address more data issues. And we also need to do more data analytics for a reasonable level of assurance. For a limited level of assurance, you just need to focus your data analytics on the problematic data. But for a reasonable level of assurance, you need to conduct the analysis for all of your data. Right now, for most of reporting frameworks that require verification is about limited verification. For example, the CDP currently awards the same verification points for both limited and a reasonable assurance engagement. So for companies that is new to verification, it's recommended to start with a limited level of assurance and then gradually shifting towards a reasonable level of assurance to prepare for the upcoming SEC rule. Then let's get back to the step 1 pre-engagement activity. We will also discuss the materiality with the client. Typically, best practice is 5%. We use the materiality threshold to classify the findings into material findings and non-material findings. For material findings, it's required to update, but not necessarily for non-material findings. During the pre-engagement activity, we will also discuss with the client whether they want us to call out any non-material findings. Most of the clients do. They are interested in at least taking a look of the findings and determine whether to implement any changes later. Step 2, verification planning. Based on the information gathered in step 1, in step 2, we will identify the materiality threshold, and we will develop a plan which will include what data we will ask for and how we will conduct the verification. And here are some examples of the plan. Company has 50 sites, and 80% of the scope 2 emissions are from 5 sites. So in this case, we will do detailed review of those 5 sites and plus 2 to 3 randomly selected sites. So when we talk about the detailed review, we will really go into the bills, review the invoices, etc. We will give some more examples in the next slides. In the next example, company has 20 sites that produce plastic. 80% of the scope 2 emissions are from 2 sites. But when we're looking at plastic production by site, 3 sites are showing small emissions for large amounts of plastic produced. So in this case, we will sort the sites by emission per plastic produced and then select sites for detailed auditing. The third example, and also wanted to note that even for a limited verification for scope 1, scope 2, we really will look at 100% of the data. It's just we choose a certain amount for a detailed review, but for the rest, we were using other methods to review to check the data if it's reasonable or not. The third example, a client has 2 sites and 10 mobile vehicles. Usually in this case, we will just do a reasonable level of assurance to check everything, basically. After a plan is developed, we will send out a formal data request, and then we will conduct interviews, which will include asking how the data was collected and what step has been done between the data was collected and between the data is collected and is used in the calculation. Step 3 is the execution of the verification activities. So in this step, we will check the data invoices. For example, we will check the calculations, check the requirements, if everything is done in conformance with the requirement. And here are some examples we will call out during the data review. Company X1 estimated the natural gas usage for Office A due to a lack of consumption data. However, during KERAMIDA's verification, it was discovered that there was documentation indicating that Office A doesn't use natural gas. So in this case, the estimation is really not necessary. It represents over-reporting, sorry. And the second example, Company X2 is a consulting firm. All offices are leased. The natural gas boiler is in the utility room of the building. So natural gas emission from the boiler is not technically at Company X2's physical site. So in this case, the natural gas usage really should be treated as purchased heating, be included in Scope 2 instead of Scope 1. So this represents a misclassification of data. And the third example, Company X3's procurement report showed a large amount of spending on advertising and consulting fees. However, all of this is excluded from their Scope 3 Category 1 without any explanation. So really, for Category 1, Scope 3 Category 1, you will want to include all your purchased goods and services. Company X4 Scope 3 Category 1 included a significant portion of spending on logistics, which should fall under either upstream transportation Category 4 or downstream transportation Category 9. So another misclassification. Company X5 obtained the natural gas usage for its Office B from the property manager. KERAMIDA calculated the natural gas intensity factor for this site and discovered that it is 10 times higher than the regional average. Subsequently, it was determined that the value had been reported in a wrong unit. So this is our identified by our risk and opportunity methodology. We just talked about an example where in detailed review, we discovered a unit error by checking the usage density. If we manually do it, it really just allows us to conduct analysis for a handful of sites. But introducing data analytics in the review process, we can use this approach in almost all the sites. So, for example, in the left graph, we plotted the electricity density in kilowatts hour per square footage in a graph. And then in the right graph, we plotted the water density in gallons per square footage in a graph. And by plotting this, it's really easy to identify the anomalies and outliers. And after we identify the outliers, we will focus our time and effort on the outliers. And when we first will see, hey, did we do anything wrong during the data aggregating? If there's wrong, then it's easy to fix. We just change the correct value. However, if we find out that it represents the actual usage, what does it mean? It can become a risk and opportunities. If it's higher than average, much higher than average, and can we look into it and see is there anything wrong? Can we improve anything to reduce the usage? Or if the outlier is extremely lower than average, is there any operations that we can learn and apply to other facilities to reduce our usage as a company? We will also evaluate the greenhouse gas disclosure. So different reporting platforms may have different requirements on how data is disclosed. So we wanted to make sure that whatever calculation you did and converted it correctly to the format that the platform is requesting. Step 4 is completion of the verification activities. So we listed it as step 4, but really we do it throughout the entire verification process. We will document our findings in your issue log, and at the end of the project, hopefully we only have the non-material findings left, so we can draw the conclusion and get an opinion. We will also be talking about the corrective actions in the next slides. So step 5 is independent assurance review and assurance of opinion. Someone in the auditing company that isn't related to this project need to assess the verification plan from a high level to understand if it's done correctly or in conformance with the plan. If relevant standards are followed, how complete is it, and is sufficient data being audited, or should more data be verified? If we find out that more data need to be verified, then we will conduct the corrective actions. And then after the corrective action is implemented, we will reevaluate the insurance. So after everything is closed, we will issue the opinion. And you can include your opinion in your submission or disclosure for whatever you want. And the deliverables, we have 2 deliverables. One is the final issue log, which will include the findings, the risks and opportunities, the suggestions and the improvements. And then we will also have the assurance letter for sure. So the insurance letter is the letter that you will want to disclose or upload to with your greenhouse gas inventory or disclosure. But the issues log is only for your internal use. You can reference it for your next year's inventory, see if there's anything that you can continuously improve. So moving forward, I would suggest to get all your data verified, not just the greenhouse gas data. So before everything become required. And also it is, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, it is really, the greenhouse gas verification is a friendly way, and the third-party verification can really be part of your continuous improvement process. So take the opportunity, ask questions, and to improve your process and the methods, and discuss the risks and opportunities with your verifier. And don't just get an assurance letter from your verification project. Yeah, I know we run out of time, but I'm happy to answer any questions.